Welcome everyone to tonight's class. Tonight we'll be doing something a little bit different. Instead of focusing on the parsha of this week, we're going to be focusing on Maimonides, on the Rambam, his life, and what we can learn from his teachings. The reason why we'll be focusing on the Rambam, on Maimonides, is because in 1984, the Rebbe started a campaign to study the Rambam's work, to study Maimonides' work of Mishnah Torah, also known as the Yad HaChazaka. There's 14 volumes in his set, which is the numerical value of the Hebrew word for Yad, for hand. It was called the strong hand, the Yad HaChazaka. The Rambam's work, as we'll learn, was controversial in his time, but later on became the basis for organized halachic writings and teachings today. Of course, it wasn't the final halachic ruling at his time. Halacha has evolved and advanced based on circumstances and new halachic rulings that needed to be ruled on at various times in our history, even till today. We're constantly, the rabbis and sages, halachic authorities are constantly looking at new scenarios that have come up along the way, and trying to interpret and understand what the halacha would be based on previous scenarios, things that they can compare it to in previous generations. So the Rambam, until the Rebbe encouraged everyone to learn Rambam, as we'll learn in his introduction, Maimonides writes that he's writing this book for everyone, to make Torah available even to the simple people. However, although the method and the style in which the Rambam writes in his book of Mishnah Torah, in Maimonides, he writes, his style is very short and concise, to just tell you what is the halacha, what exactly you need to do. He doesn't quote sources, and he keeps it all very clear to make it simple to understand. But because of that, anyone that wants to know the nuances of why the Rambam wrote something a specific way, and maybe he changed, if you look at the sources where he took that halacha from, you can see there's some of those nuances and changes, and sages throughout history and until today, in all the major study halls and yeshivas, they're always looking at Maimonides' writings and his work, and discussing it in depth, why he may have said something one way or another way. There's many commentaries on Maimonides himself, on the Rambam's work, in order to understand the depth and breadth of what his meaning interpretations. Oftentimes we can see there's a dispute between the Rambam and others in his time era that he lived in regarding certain topics. The Rambam will write his opinion just as a clear-cut halacha, and then one has to go and see what the other opinions were and compare and understand the differences between them. So until that time, it was something which was really only studied by scholars and the layman, simple people that were at a lower level of understanding didn't spend much time on the Rambam. But the Rebbe looked at the Rambam's introduction, as we will learn, that he wrote it for everyone. It was written in a style that was meant for simple people and scholars alike, in such a way that both the simple person can understand and the scholar can look even deeper and understand tremendous depths within it. Because of that, if we look at the Rambam's 14 volumes, he has his work split up according to topic. He was actually the first one to codify the laws in an organized way based on topic. And in the Talmud, you may have a discussion relating to Shabbos, and from there they bring proofs from maybe from Pesach or from Purim or from any other type of laws. And the starting point can be a conversation on Shabbos, and at the end you can be talking about something completely different and completely different topic. So the Rambam set out to establish a code of Jewish law that was organized based on topic, and he clearly states which topics are in each of the 14 volumes. Then he further divides it in each volume into more specific topics, into sections in each volume, and then each section is split up into chapters, which each chapter deals with a specific, drill it down into a more specific area, and then of course the chapters are drilled down further into sub-paragraphs, into halachas. So the Rebbe encouraged, when he started this campaign, encouraged everyone to learn Rambam, to learn Maimonides. If we look at the number of chapters that there are in Rambam, if we were to learn 3 chapters a day, we'll conclude the entire 14-volume set within a time frame of just under a year, about 11 and a half months. And those that can't do a full 3 chapters a day because it's too much, there's another second track of learning 1 chapter a day. So you finish it a person would finish it every 3 years. And every 3 years, the 3-chapter track and the 1 chapter a day track will coincide with their conclusions. And then there's another track, a third track, an even simpler, easier track, which that is, besides for this comprehensive work of the Rambam, of the Mishnah Torah's 14-volume set, he also has another work called Sefer HaMitzvot. He has the book of mitzvahs, which the Talmud tells us is tradition passed down from Moses at Mount Sinai, that there are 613 commandments, 613 mitzvahs. However, in the Torah itself, we don't see any of the psukim, any of the verses that list them out, that this is number 1, this is number 2. And there's, although we have tradition that there were 613 commandments for all that were relevant for all future generations, however, there is many commentaries that have discuss, many Jewish scholars that discuss what are the exactly included in the 613 count, and what are the rules of how we know which mitzvahs are we include in that count. So the Rambam presented his count of 613 mitzvahs. With each one, he brings the verse in the Torah where we know that specific mitzvah from. And that is his Sefer HaMitzvahs, his book of mitzvahs, which lists out all 613 mitzvahs. So the Rebbe suggested that those that are learning the 3 chapters a day, in each of the chapters we're discussing specific mitzvahs. So in order to unite all the Jewish people around the world together, in order to unite the global Jewish community together through study of the same halacha, through study of the same parts of the Torah every single day. So he suggested that the same mitzvahs that are being studied in the 3-chapter-a-day track should be studied in the someone that's just doing the mitzvahs a day should study the same mitzvahs that are being discussed at length in the 3-chapter-a-day track. From that came the 3 tracks of doing Sefer HaMitzvot, or doing 1 chapter a day of Rambam, or doing 3 chapters a day of Rambam. So on Monday, this past Monday, on Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat, is when we made the Siyum, the conclusion of the past year of study on the 3-track cycle and 3-chapter a day cycle, as well as the 1 chapter a day cycle. This is the 3rd year since they began, and anyone learning the 1 chapter a day also concluded the entire 14-volume set this past Monday. And yesterday we started again from the beginning. So if anyone is inclined to join in the global initiative of studying the Rambam's work every day, even as simple as learning a couple of mitzvahs a day, sometimes it's just a few, sometimes a few more, depending on how many mitzvahs are discussed in that day's chapters of Rambam. It's all available, explained in very beautiful classes on Chabad.org/daily study. If you want to join in on any of those 3 tracks, it's all available online. But in the meantime, we will, because of the Siyum on the Rambam, concluding it and starting again, we're going to focus on the Rambam's life and what we can learn from it and some of the teachings that he taught. Let's jump right into it. So the Rambam's life, if we look at from the beginning, from the very first moment that he was born, he had a life full of trials and tribulations. Although he authored tremendous works, besides for this 14-volume set, he also has many other books, both in Torah and in science and medicine, all very scholarly works. So the Rebbe speaks about the Rambam's life, that when we look at Maimonides' letters, especially the letter in which he describes his life and daily routine, we see that he endured unique suffering. Even at the height of his prominence, while he was at the Sultan's court, he endured suffering, physical weakness, and an overwhelming burden of responsibilities. He describes in that letter that he spent almost all of his day occupied in matters of action and speech, not in the pursuits in which his enthusiasm and pleasure truly lay, which that is intellectual study. So the Rambam, a little bit of background of Maimonides' life, of the Rambam's life. So his name was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, hence he's called the Rambam. If you take the acronym of the Resh for Rabbi, Moshe is the Mem, Be is Ben, and then his father's name was Maimon. We'll spell out Rambam in Hebrew. So when Maimonides was born, his mother actually passed away, unfortunately, in childbirth, or shortly thereafter. And he grew up as an orphan from his mother. So his father raised him. At the beginning of his life, he had a very hard time studying himself, and it's another story for another time. How at 6 years old he ended up getting a blessing from Hashem. He cried out to Hashem to help him with his being able to understand what he's being taught and the verses he was being taught, and he became a gifted child prodigy. He went and studied for a few months under the teacher of his father. His father, Rabbi Maimon, his teacher was the Migash, Rabbi Yosef Migash, and he learnt with him for a few months, and then came back home and shared. He stood up and shared in the shul on Shabbos when he came back. Tremendous depth. He gave a drasha, gave a speech expressing deep concepts in Torah, such that no one even recognized that this was the same person same child from a short while earlier. Anyways, as time has it, he was born in Cordoba, Spain, and during that time, that was nearing the end of the golden era of the Jews of Spain that were there for almost 1,000 years. At that point, nearing close to his bar mitzvah, so the Rambam was born on Erev Pesach, right before Pesach, in the year 1135. So about 13 years later, in 1148, after the Almohads invaded Spain and North Africa. Almohads were a vicious group of vicious Muslim group, Islamic group that wanted everyone, the Jews, to either worship their religion or leave, and it caused tremendous tremendous trouble for the Jewish people. And eventually, Maimonides and his family, his father and his brother, were forced to leave Cordoba, and they roamed around for a number of years to various places until they came they eventually came and semi-settled in Fez in Morocco. There they lived for about 5 or 6 years in Morocco until they ended up leaving and going. They went to Israel for a short while and settled thereafter in Egypt, in Cairo. They lived. He ended up living in Fustat, and during that time of his travels, during the time before he ended up practicing medicine, he never intended to practice medicine. The deal was that although he studied a lot of, he was very well versed in medicine and science as well as Torah subjects. He never intended to use medicine as a means of earning a living. He had a deal with his younger brother David, that he was a successful merchant, and his younger brother supported him. He went and traveled to various countries and places, exchanging merchandise, and he supported both his own family and his brother's family and his father as well. Tragically, after at a certain point in time, shortly after they came to Egypt, his brother was on a trip on a boat, traveling to exchange merchandise, and somewhere in the Indian Sea, the boat they encountered a terrible storm, and the boat capsized, and his brother perished in that accident. Together with it, he also had with him a tremendous amount of not only his own money, but also the Rambam's money that was belonged to him, and other belongings of the family. And at that point, he was left with very little to his name. And not only did he have to now support his own family, he also needed to support his brother's widow and child as well. As we'll see in a letter, the Rambam actually writes about that tragic event. Thereafter, he writes in a letter that he felt from that experience, from after hearing the news of his brother's passing, he fell ill, and he writes that he became bedridden for almost an entire year. He suffered tremendously from inflammation, high fever, and depression. So much so that he nearly lost his life during that time period. Thereafter, he managed to get out of it, and at that point, he needed to earn his own living. And then he began practicing medicine, becoming his medicine practice became very renowned and well known, and he was hired as the personal physician of the vizier of Egypt, and then later on as to the Sultan himself. Aside from his brother's passing, there was within that time, within a short period of a couple years, he lost in tragic events. He lost his father had passed away, as well as his wife and some of his children. So he suffered tremendous. Besides for running away from one place to another, as many of the Jews needed to do at that time from Spain and other places, he also suffered tremendous personal tragedies in his lifetime. And yet, although he suffered so much himself, he still found time to author and work on his Torah study. Not as much as he would have liked to, but certainly managed to put together quite a number of works even during that time frame. As the Rebbe continues here, it is evident to anyone who reflects on the greatness of Maimonides that these are the areas that he was passionate about and enthusiastic about. He emphasizes in several places, particularly in the Guide for the Perplexed, that a person's true perfection lies in wisdom and intellect. So certainly the Rambam would have loved to just continue working an entire day and night on intellectual pursuits of wisdom and intellect, continuing his efforts in studying Torah and writing, authoring books on the Torah and other areas. So the fact that he needed to spend so much time practicing medicine and helping people out physically was something that was very taxing on the Rambam. Here we see in a letter, this is a letter written to Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibbon. The Rambam wrote another book. Besides the Mishnah Torah, one of his works that he wrote was called the Moreh Nevuchim. Moreh Nevuchim, translated as the Guide for the Perplexed or the Downtrodden, was a philosophical work that was written to answer questions of those that were challenged by the various philosophical approaches at that time. And it was written in the language that the Jews spoke in the area where he lived, and therefore was written in Arabic, or Judeo-Arabic, version of Arabic that was spoken at the time. So that way the simple Jews would be able to read it and understand it and learn from it. After it was published, it became a well-known work, and there were requests that he should translate it into Hebrew and other languages, so that it will be able to be learned by Jews in other countries and places that don't speak Arabic. Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibbon was one of the people that translated it from its original Arabic into Hebrew, into Lashon HaKodesh. And although there was a number of people that translated it, Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibbon corresponded with Maimonides, corresponded directly with the Rambam on various things, on various questions that he had, in order to get the translation as close as possible and the intent as close as possible to the original. At the end, the Rambam himself gave approbation to that work and endorsed his work. So part of Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tabban's work in translating Maimonides' works, he felt that it would be worthwhile for him to come. He lived near France at the time, and he figured it would be worthwhile for him to travel to Egypt to be able to Cairo to meet the Rambam in person and clarify a number of things that he wanted to clarify in his translation. So the Rambam pens this letter in response to tell him that I would love to meet you and spend time with you, however, I barely have any time at all. And therefore he enumerates here, he lists out what a typical daily schedule looked like for him at that time. So this is what the Rambam writes to his friend Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tabban. I reside in Old Cairo, Egypt. So he lived in Fustat, which was Old Cairo, and the king resides in New Cairo, a distance away. The work I do for the king, for the Sultan, is very difficult for me. I must visit him every morning, and when he or a family member falls ill, I do not leave the palace for the majority of the day. So most of the day he's spending in the palace if someone's ill. I return home in the afternoon, hungry. The streets are full of people, Gentiles and Jews, simple people and noblemen, judges and police officers, friends and enemies, all are waiting my return. Even his enemies or enemies of the Jews, people that he perceived as enemies, came to him for their medical advice and help. The Rambam continues and tells him what happens when I come home. I dismount. So he came off of his animal he was riding on. I wash my hands. I go out to excuse myself to the crowd while I first have something to eat. And he says that was my only meal of the day. So first he gets off, he comes down, and before he goes into the house, he sees a whole crowd of people, and he feels it's necessary to walk over to them and excuse himself that he needs to go eat something. And he goes and takes a bite, and he says that's his meal for the day. Then I go to treat the assembled crowd and write them prescriptions and medical guidance. They come and go one after another until nighttime, and sometimes 2 hours into the night. So until dark, people would come, and sometimes a couple hours after dark. Out of great exhaustion, I see them while lying down, and when night falls, I am utterly exhausted, unable to speak. So he's so exhausted from his day that he's laying down and resting while he's seeing patients and giving them advice and writing them prescriptions and helping them with their ailments and illnesses until he's so exhausted, he says, that he's barely able to speak when he's done. Ultimately, so now what happens to his guidance to his community? He was the rabbi of the Jewish community as well. So when can he provide guidance if he's busy in the palace all day and helping people with their in his medical practice? When does he have time to guide the rest of the people? Ultimately, Jews are unable to speak privately with me except for Shabbat, when all or most of the congregation comes to me after the services. Then I guide the community and teach them what they need to know for the upcoming week. They study Torah with me until the afternoon, and then they go on their way. Some of them return to study with me after the afternoon prayers until the evening prayers. So he's basically saying that Shabbos is the one day that he's not practicing medicine. That's the time he has for the community. If there's any holidays in the upcoming week, any special halachas that are relevant, any information that's needed that he needs to teach them for the coming week, he would do it the Shabbos in advance. He would give them, try to teach them all that they needed to know and answer all of their questions for things that were upcoming in the coming week, and then would spend more time teaching and studying with them throughout the rest of the day. And the Rambam concludes this letter by saying, this is my daily schedule, and I've only recounted just some of what you shall observe if you shall visit me with God's help. So he's basically telling him, if you want to come visit me, this is what I listed out is a typical day for me, and I've only told you the basics. If you come and actually observe, you'll see that I have very little time. So basically your intent of coming to visit me is wonderful, but practically I won't have any time to spend with you, so it's likely not worth your effort. Any comments or questions before we continue? So aside from, this is all the tremendous toll that his life at that time took on his physical well-being, and the extreme circumstances and pressure that he was under during that time. In addition to all the physical suffering, his tragedies that he had to deal with in his own life, in addition to all the pressures of his communal pressures and need to visit the palace and take care of the royal family, that was all in his physical well-being or pressures of leading his community and taking care of the people locally. However, in addition to that, the Rambam also suffered tremendous opposition internally from within the scholar Torah community across the world. Maimonides also suffered internal opposition in the Jewish community, which went far beyond ordinary criticism and rose to the level of persecution. This is recorded in his letters and responsa, as well as in the letters and responsa of his contemporaries. The matter is well known to students of Torah history. In his letters, Maimonides writes that he does not wish to enter into polemical disputes. He was aware of the persecutions and responded to questions and objections, but his opponents sought to wage a battle against him, and he refused to engage in this. He instructed his students to act similarly. So, what was the opposition to the Rambam? There were a couple of major points that caused tremendous opposition to the Rambam, which began as a Torah dispute, and of course, once there is arguments and discussions from those that have very good intentions and a high level of understanding, it trickles down to others that aren't necessarily the best of people and follow along in the opposition. So the number one, the Rambam, as we mentioned in his Mishnah Torah, he writes as follows. As we see in source number 3, this is from the introduction to his book, the Mishnah Torah. This is in the preface, and he basically goes through, which that itself is a scholarly work, that into that few-page introduction, that he goes through the entire oral tradition of where it was passed down from one generation to the next. And then he writes, to ensure that nobody ever need another book for any Jewish law, this work gathers all of the oral Torah together, along with the enactments, the customs and decrees that developed from Moses' time until the Talmud, as explained by the Gaonim in their post-Talmudic writings. Therefore, the Rambam says, I have titled this work Mishnah Torah, which means, the literal translation of Mishnah Torah means the repetition of the Torah, second to the Torah. For a person ought to learn from the written Torah and then read this and know the oral Torah in its entirety, and need not read any other book in the interim. So, if we look at the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the Chumash, the very last of the 5 books, called Devarim, Deuteronomy, is also referred to as Mishnah Torah. It's also referred to as the book of Mishnah Torah because it's a repetition. It's basically Moses repeating everything that took place in the previous generations that the Jewish people went through until that point, reviewing and reiterating and teaching, preparing them for the future for his passing. He went through many of the subjects again that were previously discussed. So here the Rambam says, if you want to understand not just the written Torah of the Chumash, you also want to understand the oral tradition, which, as he explains in the introduction at length, that when God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, when Hashem spoke the Torah, he told Moshe a verse, write down this specific verse, and then he orally gave him the explanation of it. For example, the mitzvah of tefillin, it says in the Torah that we should bind for yourself, you should bind these verses for yourself as a sign upon your arm and a symbol between your eyes. And that's about it that the Torah tells us about it. Exactly how the tefillin should be made. They should be black, and with the black straps and the parchments that are put inside of it. All those details is all oral tradition that was passed down from one generation to the next. Now that was never written. For many generations it was not written down up until the Mishnah. The Mishnah was authored by a sage by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, also known as just by the plain Rebbe, our teacher, because it was such a renowned work. And at that point, he felt that Jews were being dispersed around the world into various places, and if we're not going to write down until that point, until the times of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, till the time of the writing of the Mishnah, scholars had their own notebooks with their own what they learnt from their teachers, private notes that were written for themselves, but publicly it was all just given orally from teacher to student, from generation to generation. It was never penned in a formal fashion, organized for everyone to learn. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi felt that at that time, if it wasn't going to be recorded and written down, it would be completely forgotten. And because of that, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi decided to put it all together. Him and his students worked putting it together, the book of the Mishnah, and took all those previous discussions from earlier generations and brought the actual halacha. It was still written in a very concise and short format, and it was memorized. Then came the next generations, the generation of the Talmud, which then they took the Mishnah and were discussing at length what exactly the Mishnah meant, and there's all kinds of arguments and discussions. And that was the book of the Talmud, also known as the Gemara, is the basics. That's the basis for all halacha, all Jewish law is based in the Mishnah and the Talmud. But then came the Rambam and looked and came and said and was realizing that there's this book of the Talmud is only available for study for those that are able to understand it. Which, number one, the Talmud was written in language of Aramaic. That was the language spoken at the time, the Jewish language spoken at the time in Babylonia, where the Talmud was authored. Many people already in the Rambam's time did not understand the language and couldn't understand what the Talmud was saying. And secondly, even if one were to understand what the Talmud is discussing, it's all kinds of discussions back and forth to actually understand what we practically need to do. That was something that only a scholar would actually be able to understand what the actual halacha was. It's like someone asks a question, if something is kosher, and you start giving him a whole explanation. Well, if it has this inside of it, it may be kosher. If not, it's not. If you can use it in this way, you can't use it another way. You start giving a whole explanation about how the person can discover and figure out if that food may be kosher or not. They'll walk away saying, that's too much for me to handle. Either they'll decide to eat it or not. The Rambam wanted to take all of those discussions aside and just drill down to the bottom line, the actual halacha, that a simple person will be able to understand it and learn. And therefore he says that he's writing this book in a format that one can just learn the written Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, and the Nevi'im and the Ksuvim, the Tanakh, and then afterwards you can learn, instead of you don't need to look at the Mishnah and the Talmud in order to learn the oral tradition. All you need to do is after you study the Tanakh, then you can come and study Mishnah Torah. The second book of the Torah, you can study it, and here you'll have everything laid out in simple, clear, concise format to be able to understand it. And the Rambam continues, The Rambam continues saying that he's writing it for kakatan, kagadol, for a simple person, and a scholarly person can come to this book and understand it in the same way. So because of these words that the Rambam writes, that you can it sounds like he's saying that you can discard the Talmud and Mishnah and only look at Mishnah Torah. There are those scholars that read this and thought that were concerned that the Rambam is beginning a new style of religion, that we're disregarding hundreds of years of the scholarly works of the Mishnah and Talmud, and now you can disregard it. You can only learn the Rambam's work. Just learn Maimonides and Mishnah Torah and you'll be good. Of course, that's not what the Rambam ever meant. The Rambam meant that for those that it's difficult to learn Mishnah and Talmud, you can now have a book where you can see everything clearly and concisely. He wasn't advocating, God forbid, that we should do away with the Mishnah and Talmud. That's where he sourced everything in to begin with. and he was just explaining that this book is written in a format that anyone can understand it. Simple people and scholarly people alike can understand this, and with this, you can fulfill the obligation of studying the entire Torah. You study the Tanakh, study the Mishnah Torah, and then you'll have all of the all the information that you need in order to study the Torah in its entirety. Of course, you should study it more in depth. You could go to the Talmud and the Mishnah and all the commentaries there and understand it in depth. But because of this idea that the Rambam wrote, that you can not go straight from Tanakh to the Mishnah Torah, you don't need any other book in between. This was one cause of an uproar within the scholarly community. Another issue was that because of the format that he was writing it in and wanted to write it in such a simple and concise format, he doesn't include sources in his writing. He just, of course, everything that he wrote had its source, but that's left for the scholar to go and figure out what the source is and where it comes from, what he meant. He did not include notes in this work of where each thing comes from, which was another point which many scholars took issue with. And then, aside from the Mishnah Torah itself, as we mentioned earlier, he wrote the book of Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, which was a philosophical work. And in that, in the works of the Rambam in philosophy and medicine, he quotes other non-Jewish sources of theories and ideas from the past and from his time. And other Jewish scholars took issue with the fact that he's quoting from other sources as well. And these points of contention blew up even more so after Maimonides had already passed away, so much so it became such a strong opposition that there were those that were tried as hard as they could to do away with the Rambam's works and have them completely eliminated from any Jewish bookshelf. And they were unsuccessful doing it themselves. They were so set on this mission, so to speak, of getting rid of the Rambam's work and the threat that they thought that it posed to Judaism at the time, that they enlisted the help of the church to try and get them to collect all the books of the Rambam and have them publicly burned. Unfortunately, they were successful, and that took place. When that happened, even those that were again publicly opposed to the Rambam's works thought that many of them thought that this was taking it a step too far. And not long after that, the same thing happened with the Talmud itself. They said, if the books of the Rambam are say things that are against other religions, and we have to get rid of them. The source of those is in the Talmud itself. And someone came and told them that the Talmud itself should also, once they had this idea of destroying the Rambam's books, they also had a public burning of the Talmud itself. At that time, one of the greatest leaders of the opposition against the Rambam was Rabbeinu Yonah, and Rabbeinu Yonah then saw that they were just how far it went. They were burning the Talmud. He's like, that was way too much for him to handle. He went then and actually looked and explored much more deeply into the teachings of the Rambam and learned it much more in depth, and started focusing on trying to understand what exactly the Rambam meant and what his works, what the purpose of them was. And after examining everything and looking at it, he came to the conclusion that he was in the wrong, and the Rambam, he recognized the greatness of the Rambam and publicly went on at the end of his life to praise the Rambam and promote Maimonides' work, so much so that he actually attempted to go, the Rambam after his passing, he passed away shortly before the age of 70 in the year 1204 on the 20th of Teves, and he was buried in Israel in Tiberia. So the Rabbeinu Yonah went. He tried to go to the Rambam's caver, to his gravesite, in order to ask forgiveness for everything that he did against the Rambam's work. Till that point, he was at that time he was already older in his age, and he passed away before he actually made it to Tiberia to be able to ask his forgiveness. But we see from this whole story at the time, eventually things settled down, and the Rambam's books and works became accepted as a worldwide and take the prominent place on Jewish libraries and on Jewish homes and yeshiva libraries around the world. And like I said at the beginning of the class, it's something that in every yeshiva is learned and studied with tremendous depth. But having said that, we see that the Rambam's life by no means was easy, both physically, internally within the scholarly community. He set the stage for really throwing a wrench into everything the way scholarship was taught and shared up until that point. He looked at every single person, every single Jew, no matter what level of learning they are. They have to teach them and educate them, and therefore he set out to write this work in a simple way that anyone can learn from it and have an impact on everyone around him. Oops. Later, when the basis of the reports and the opposition was carefully examined, so this was later on, when the basis of the reports against the Rambam was carefully examined by Rabbeinu Yonah, it became clear that it rested on a mistake. Therefore, God forbid that anyone should denigrate Maimonides in any way. This is illustrated by the story related about the leading figure in Jewish ethical teachings in the generation of Maimonides, or the generation following him. This person had been a fierce opponent of Maimonides. He did not rest until he had investigated the claims thoroughly, because the matter troubled him so deeply that he was unable to rest without clarifying it. When he himself examined the details, he reached the correct conclusion and underwent a complete reversal. He became one of Maimonides' most enthusiastic supporters, with remarkable passion and a deep personal attachment to everything connected to the Rambam. On this topic, we find something incredible in Maimonides' writings. So now we see that the Rambam had a very difficult life, both in terms of his the Jewish community at the time, running from one place to the next to find safety and refuge. In his personal life, the various tragedies from being orphaned at a young age until losing his wife and child, other children, and his brother that were his source of sustenance, until ultimately needing to support himself with medicine. Together with that, all of the challenges that he experienced within the Jewish scholarly community, opposition to his writings and his approach. And yet we find that this incredible take of the Rambam in his Guide for the Perplexed, he discusses a very important question. The question that he discusses is the view of the world. Is the world a beautiful place? Is the world essentially a garden, an orchard of Hashem that also has negative forces in it? Or is the world a bad place that also happens to have some good inside of it? Is it ultimately good or ultimately bad? So on this topic, we find something incredible in Maimonides' writings, in Moreh Nevuchim. Maimonides dedicates several chapters in the Guide for the Perplexed to explain how we should view the world. Is the world a place where the negative forces dominate, far from being a garden or orchard? Or should we view the world positively as the orchard of God himself, meaning that despite the fact that God has many worlds to choose from, he chose this lowly, mundane, and physical world to be his home. So which is it? Is this physical world the ultimate home of Hashem, that he wants his presence felt here, and this is the place that is meant to be his orchard, his garden, his home? Or is it something where negativity and evil forces are controlling it and most powerful? His conclusion is that the proper Torah perspective is that we should view the world in a positive light, with hope and with confidence about the future. He elaborates on the consequences of this perspective, and he discusses about what it means that if a person has this world perspective of everything being that this is the place, God's home and his orchard, his place where he chose to be his home and his presence being here, then all the other things that happen around us become less relevant when we have this perspective, recognizing that we have the opportunity of bringing bringing godliness into this world. The question, of course, is how can we be happy? Just as this applies to the life of the great legal authority and guide for the perplexed people, so does it apply to the life of all Jewish people. The Torah testifies about the Jewish people in the present era, before the coming of Mashiach, that they are anguished, suppressed, and despised, etc. This is so central a theme in Judaism that it even serves as a condition in the process of conversion. So the Rambam, another point, another uniqueness of the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam is that he includes in his work every single halacha, every single mitzvah that's relevant both in our times today and those mitzvahs that will only be relevant when Mashiach comes. He includes everything from the 7 mitzvahs that were given, 7 Noahide laws that were given to all mankind, up until including all the 613 mitzvahs that were given to the Jewish people, both those that are relevant today and after Mashiach comes. Whereas in Shulchan Aruch and other halachic works, they mainly focus on what's relevant today and don't really discuss so much about the mitzvahs that are only relevant in Messianic times. Like all the laws of the offerings that are only relevant in temple times, which we don't have today. Many of those, all those set of halachas are not brought down in many of the other halachic works. So the Rambam discusses also the process of a convert, someone becoming Jewish, which for many generations was not really so relevant, because changing religion, becoming Jewish was something which was which in many places and areas was punishable by death. So it was not something that many people were looking and trying to do. But he writes, this is what part of what the Rambam writes of this process. Then what is the process for accepting a sincere convert? When a non-Jew approaches us and seeks to convert, we ask them, What have you seen that you wish to convert? Are you unaware that the Jewish people in the present era are anguished, suppressed, despised, persecuted, and suffering? So he rules that part of the process is that if someone's not Jewish, wants to come and convert, we should discourage them and ask them, why do you want to become part of the Jewish people if you see all the suffering that our nation has encountering in this time prior to Mashiach coming. This was suffering that the Rambam was talking about already in the 12th century, 800 and some odd years ago, and of course since then we've had unfortunately many more suffering, painful situations up until our very day and age. So when a non-Jew comes to convert, part of the halacha is you need to tell them and point out the suffering and persecution that we go through. At the same time, the Jewish people are commanded to serve God with joy. So on one hand, you see the suffering the Rambam went through. You see the suffering that even in halacha you have to share with a potential convert, that suffering is part of the makeup of the Jewish people currently in our state of exile before Mashiach is coming, which sounds like that's our destiny right now, is to be pained and suffer and for us to suffer until Mashiach comes. But at the same time, we have a mitzvah of Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha. We have to serve God with joy. The requirement to be joyful is an instruction and demand of the Torah of truth, and not just as a secondary matter, as a kind of preparation for serving God. It necessarily follows that there is a true basis for joy. We cannot be demanded to do something that is false, contrary to the Torah of truth. This demand itself comes from the Torah of truth. So the Torah is telling us, and we know everything that's in the Torah is 100% truthful and correct. How could the Torah tell us, serve Hashem with joy? We're supposed to serve Hashem with joy when we just finished saying that our destiny is to suffer and to be in pain and be despised by the other nations around us. How can the Torah come and tell us that we're supposed to serve Hashem joyfully? Not just a pretend joy. We should actually be joyful. The Torah is telling us that we can be joyful. So how do these two things coincide with each other? How do they work together with each other? Especially knowing the Rambam, where the Rambam's life took him. How does he come and share in Moreh Nevuchim how we should look at the world as such a beautiful place when looking around? It sure seems the opposite oftentimes. So the Rebbe gives a beautiful explanation. The explanation for this is that even before we come into the world, God has already come into the world beforehand. God's coming is such that the world becomes a dwelling place for him. The divine presence was originally in the lower realms. When Hashem created the world, the Medrash tells us that Ikar Shechina B'Tachtonim Haisa, the divine presence of Hashem was originally in the lower realms, and then through various sins it receded, it went back up, it ascended back up from heaven to heaven through the seven heavens, until we had, countering that, there were seven sages, seven people that were meritorious people throughout history that brought back the divine presence from one world to the next, until the seventh, which was Moses at Mount Sinai, which brought the presence of Hashem back into this physical realm. And since the giving of the Torah, that is our job, to continue bringing that presence back into the world through our fulfillment of each and every mitzvah and by studying Hashem's Torah. Since we are together with God in the same dwelling, we're together with Hashem in the very same home, it is clear that the fact that the Jewish people in the present era are anguished, suppressed, and despised, it does not register for us at all. It's not relevant comparing it to the greater good which we're experiencing being in the same place as Hashem. This is like someone, the Rebbe explains, who is experiencing an exceptionally great pleasure, and in the midst of all of it, he's bitten by a mosquito. They wouldn't even feel the bite. It's annoying, it's a nuisance, it's a little itchy, but it's not something that's going to take away from your tremendous enjoyment and pleasure that you're experiencing at that time. It's not that they deny there was a bite. They know there was a bite. They just don't feel it because of the great pleasure they are experiencing as a result of being present in the same dwelling with Hashem. So it's not that the mosquito didn't hurt. It does hurt, but in comparing it to the greater enjoyment that they're experiencing at that time, it's not relevant. Similarly, we know that the mosquito is biting. We know that we're suffering and all kinds of trials and challenges and tribulations that we go through, that we've been through in the time of exile through history. However, that pales in comparison with knowing that we're in the same dwelling as Hashem, bringing God's presence even more into this world. Another example of this the Rebbe gives is this is like someone telling a merchant who has millions of gold coins that he lost a single penny today. The merchant would look at him as though he had lost his mind. What difference does it make if he lost a penny when he himself says that he earned millions? This, however, applies only to someone who knows what gold coins are. It is not the case for someone who only knows copper pennies or just valueless tokens. Such a person doesn't see the gold coins at all. All they see is a worn copper penny that was lost. So if someone's currency, the only money that they're used to seeing, someone's a pauper, and the only money that they're used to seeing is the copper coins, and they have no idea what gold and silver look like. To them, the gold and silver is like the Iranian currency. So it's valueless. They don't know what it is. It looks like it looks completely useless to them. All they know is what they're used to. They're used to these copper coins, and now we see a copper coin was lost. Oy vey! I saw a copper coin being dropped from this wealthy man's pocket. He's going crazy. How come he's not turning around to pick it up? When in reality, he doesn't realize that for the wealthy man that's earning has millions of gold and silver coins, this is completely irrelevant to him. But the guy that's chasing after this copper coin doesn't see that because he doesn't see the gold and silver. So too in our case, the condition of being anguished, suppressed, and despised is a real thing, recognized by Torah and observed by non-Jews. But it has no real standing for a Jew, just as the loss of a penny has no standing for someone who possesses millions of gold coins. So in other words, someone, the non-Jew that's looking, that doesn't recognize the beauty of the Torah and the mitzvahs, doesn't recognize the gold and silver, doesn't recognize the fact that Hashem is here in this world. He was here before us. God came into this world to make this his private home. All of the spiritual realms prior to creating this world that God went through in order to come to this physical world are not the ones that he chose to be his home. God's presence, Hashem chose this physical world is the place where I want my essence to dwell. And how can my essence dwell here? Is by you fulfilling my will, by fulfilling what the Torah teaches us. Every mitzvah that we do, we bring more godliness into this world and make the home even greater and better than ever before. So from an outsider looking that doesn't recognize that gold and silver, doesn't see that connection to Hashem, doesn't see God's presence in this world, all they see is the copper coin that's lost. All they see is the suffering and anguish and the fact that we're despised by many others around us. And therefore, it's important for a potential convert to come. Let them know that this is what you're seeing. It's true. We are despised, anguished, we're suppressed, and we have all kinds of trials, challenges, and tribulations. However, when the person continues and begins to recognize the godliness that there is in this world, then you can come and join the Jewish people, and we tell ourselves, we teach ourselves and those around us that all of this, all of our suffering, even the tremendous suffering that we've encountered throughout history, and even in our recent history, all pales in comparison with the gold and silver that we have the opportunity to connect with Hashem and bring godliness into this world and continue to make this physical world a home and place for Hashem. And we recognize that each and every mitzvah that we have, it's not another thing, another commandment that we must fulfill. It's not another burden on our heads. It's something that we have the opportunity to connect to Hashem and bring godliness more and more into this world and invite him into our home. Imagine you have the most important person, the person that you look up to the most in the world, comes to visit you, wants to come visit you often. Here we have it. Hashem, the King of the world, the creator of the entire universe, is coming to dwell with us in our home, in the physical world around us. And it's our opportunity, it's our merit and opportunity to be able to bring that godliness more and more into this world. And hopefully very soon, with all of our efforts together, will we merit the coming of Mashiach, where we won't have that anguish and suffering. Even those copper coins won't be lost, and will only be only good things, happy things, and pleasant things together.